This is an overview of the Brown versus Board of Education reading by James Anderson, and I'll try to get some of the key points here. What I want you to know by the end is a little bit of the legacy and the issue, both issues that led up to Brown v. Board and then the post-Brown era. How Supreme Court rulings have changed, some of the contemporary issues around segregation, um, the legacy of Brown, and then the sort of connection with the African American community, and how it impacted the African American community. And there's some other kind of key points that are laid out. And I think if you look at the study guide, it would be really helpful. One of the things that I really try to do with this reading is there are a lot of court cases that are mentioned, and I really want to boil it down to a few kind of key pieces of legislation, and so that you understand kind of how Brown versus Board is impacted substantive equality or individual equality in our Constitution, and then also to know the other story of Brown that's laid out in the piece. The author was somebody I studied under. He was on my dissertation committee, professor at the University of Illinois, very, very well known and highly regarded historian of education. And where James Anderson begins, is talking about Derek Bell. And I can just tell you that for myself, I was in Topeka, Kansas, for the 50th commemoration of the Brown decision, and I got to meet some of the people who are adults now but were children when the Brown decision happened, who were and as a side note, Brown was there were a number of different court cases that were bundled together. The reason it's known as Brown is because the court docket, it was by alphabetical order. The first name on the list was Mr. Brown. But there were a lot of different people involved, and we got to meet some of those people. And the major discussion at the 50th anniversary was the lack of progress and problems since the Brown decision. And there were a number of books that came out right around the time of the 50th commemoration. And you can tell from all the titles, for this one with Derek Bell, The Unfulfilled Hopes of Racial Reform. And what Derek Bell opens with is sort of recalling it at the Yale commencement. There was a speaker from the Brown team who talks, and everybody stands up and applauds, and this huge applause washes over the crowd when they mention Brown versus Board. And he's thinking to himself, how could something that accomplished so little have impacted us so much? And so what James Anderson wants to do is sort of address this question, but in a different way, and to basically say, look, we should appreciate and commemorate Brown. It has played a positive role in our society, but there's kind of two sides to it. So he if you look at the title of his piece, it's a reference obviously to A Tale of Two Cities, famous Charles Dickens novel, and that opens, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. And that's, I think, basically the situation for the African American community. It was this great euphoria of this win that had been, this ongoing struggle, and yet at the same time there was a major backlash, and and so those kind of two domains. Now, the first story that we want to tell is that of equality and the constitutional legacy that Brown's a part of. And to do that, what you need to do is kind of go back and think about the opening of the Declaration of Independence. It opens with, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men created equal. And I've mentioned before in this class that men was sort of a stand-in for humankind. So it was this idea of a basic human equality, that all human beings, and an inherent dignity and equality that we should all hold. That's the foundation of the society, at least in its ideal form. So we have the Declaration of Independence written. We have a 10-year gap where we're fighting the American Revolution, and then people come together to sit down to write the Constitution. And at that time, basically, they look around and a significant portion of the population is enslaved. You have slavery as one of the most key points. And the other factor here, too, is that, that we've talked about before is women. 50% of the population in terms of women are subjugated or don't have, basic sort of equality or human rights. So after the Constitution, there's a period of time, and I'm going to talk about the 14th Amendment a little bit in depth, but really quickly, the 13th Amendment ends slavery. There was a movie a while back called Lincoln with Daniel Day-Lewis, and really what that movie is about, it's Abraham Lincoln, but it's him trying to get the 13th Amendment passed, and that struggle to do that. So that ended slavery, amended our Constitution. The 15th Amendment was universal suffrage for men. Women's voting rights didn't come until quite a bit later, but men achieved the right to vote, African American men. Now, of course, if you've seen movies like Selma, you'll know that African Americans were disenfranchised from voting, and you could state to a large extent that struggle continues. But at least the Voting Rights Act, sort of empowered African Americans to begin voting in most of the South and a lot of the country, and that wasn't until the 1960s. But at least here, it is added to our Constitution. I'll come back to the 14th Amendment. So there's a number of different, after the Civil War, a number of different pieces of legislation um, that sort of happened. And one that I just want to kind of focus on for our purposes is Charles Sumner, um, fairly, radical representative at that time period. As a quick note, another congressman was mentioned from Indiana, a Republican who was opposed to slavery and fought on behalf of the Civil Rights Act and civil rights for African Americans in the time period. But Charles Sumner wanted the word white removed from the word white, referring to quote like whites, from the naturalization clause, because that was the idea that citizenship rights and general protections and rights and values were associated with being white in this country. And he did that on the basis of individual equality espoused in the Declaration of Independence. And so that's important for you guys to remember. He also Civil Rights Act at that time period. So the thing that happens is we get the 14th Amendment, and the 14th Amendment is probably, in my mind, one of our most substantial kind of pieces of constitutional legacy. It's known as the Equal Protection Clause. That's something I would like for you guys to remember. Equal protection under the law. And the 14th Amendment does a lot in terms of your Miranda rights, rights against self-incrimination, right to representation. All these kind of rights come under the 14th Amendment. But really what it does is it kind of reinstates in the constitutional legacy the idea that there's one group of rights holders. We all have inherent rights as people and as citizens of this country. That's kind of a key part of the 14th Amendment. Now that comes shortly after the Civil War, but then there's a bit of a backlash in this country, and you get a number of cases that begin to kind of undermine the 14th Amendment. And he gives a number of these. What I want you to focus on is Plessy v. Ferguson. And what Plessy does, Plessy was a gentleman who was riding a train car outside of New Orleans, and he wanted to challenge segregated train cars, African American. So he purposely sits in the white section. He gets arrested, refuses to move when he's told to move, gets arrested with the intention of challenging segregation under the 14th Amendment. And what the Supreme Court does is upholds the idea here of separate, or creates the idea in a sense of separate but equal. And what James Anderson says, this ushers in the almost 60-year nightmare of Jim Crow in the United States, or our form of apartheid. Um, Almost 60 years of legally sanctioned segregation, and really, almost like two different societies, two different, um, you know, um, forms of treatment and things like that. Um, so on the left, if you have a copy, or to do this, I think it would be really helpful, and to know a key phrase from each piece of legislation on the left. And I'll go through those really quickly. So the Declaration of Independence is all men created equal. Um, and then the idea of substantive equality. The Constitution um, ignored individual equality. The only reference that James Anderson points out, the only reference to equality in the Constitution is equal representation. It has to do with our legislature, but not with us as individuals in this country. So there's no reference to equality. The only reference is to equal representation in the national legislature. The 14th Amendment ushers in the idea of the equal protection, um, the uh, equal protection under the law, or the Equal Protection Clause, or again inserts substantive equality into the Constitution. Plessy v. Ferguson is separate but equal. Was deemed to be constitutionally viable, but of course segregation was not equal in this time period. And then what Brown versus Board does is Brown versus Board of Education. Um, Brown versus Board of Education basically says separate is inherently unequal. Separate schools are inherently unequal. And so I would remember the key phrase with that. And so Brown versus Board then overturns Plessy and reinstates the 14th Amendment. And what James Anderson wants to note there is that that's a major contribution to our historical legacy. And another key point that I want you to remember here is that once Brown happens, there's a number of movements for individual equality that come out of Brown versus Board of Education that maybe would not have been possible was it not for Brown versus Board of Education. And some examples of that I'd like you to be aware of are one, the ADA, the Individuals with Disabilities Act, comes out of this legacy of individual equality, substantial equality, or one group of rights holders. So the Americans with Disabilities Act, and then of course that in turn leads to 94-142 ideal, all the legislation dealing with schools and inclusion and those kinds of things come out of the legacy of Brown. Another example would be women and Title IX. Title IX is something that's talked about a lot today, and sometimes we think of it as sports, relating to women's sports, but it does actually a lot more than that. It provides educational opportunity for women, especially in higher education, and more equitable access. Other examples of legislation after Brown would be the Bilingual Education Act, elderly discrimination, not discriminating against the elderly in this country, comes out of Brown v. Board. And just to give you a more contemporary example that's not mentioned in the reading, when marriage equality went to the court, the Supreme Court ruled on marriage equality, same-sex marriage, and did so specifically referencing the 14th Amendment. The idea that you can't have two different systems. Basically, we have one group of rights holders in this country, like in a sense. So that's the one tale of Brown that he wants to tell. And now what I'm going to do is switch gears and get into the other tale of Brown versus Board of Education. Now, the Reconstruction era for after the Civil War was relatively a good period for African Americans. They were politically enfranchised. Now, again, this is relative in terms of the time period, but in terms of education, African Americans immediately began setting up networks of schools. Teachers went to the South to begin working with African American students. Um, teacher training programs were set up for African Americans. And in certain places, like examples are given, like in Alabama, African Americans are about 45% of the population. They receive about that amount of funding for their schools. So it was a somewhat relatively positive time period. Now, in the Jim Crow era, all of that progress or those positive things were unwound, and African Americans, um, that funding just dropped. I mean, it was basically gone. So, and that, to give you an example, again, like coming back to Alabama, um, African Americans were about 45% of the population. They only received about 10 to 15% of the funding for education. So it's virtually nothing. And African Americans had to hold schools or develop their own schools. They examples are given like the Rosenwald schools. So they African Americans pool their money together, donate, and develop this system of schools throughout the South, and in a number of different areas. And a key concept here that I want you to be familiar with in the Jim Crow era is double taxation, and that is that African Americans paid for white schools through their taxes and then had to pay for their own schools out of pocket. So double taxation. The other example that I wanted you guys to be familiar with is Ware High School, and you can look this up in the reading. Basically, in Georgia, there was one high school in the entire state for African Americans. The state wanted to close it down and turn it into an elementary school, meaning there would be no high school or no secondary education for African Americans. It went to the Supreme Court. African Americans took it all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court um, allowed Georgia to shut down the school. And so a number of states, he references about 11 different states, and I think most of those had no secondary education for African Americans through much of the 20th century, and a few of the other states had one high school for African Americans. So African Americans basically did not receive access to secondary education through much of the country through the 20th century. And I'll get into the post-Brown era a little bit here. Um, this is a little bit, again, the background of Brown, some of the uh, situation here. You can see these states in black had legal segregation. You had to be segregated. In the North, a lot of times it was on a district by district basis, and some places just didn't have any legislation around it. Again, this is in the 1950s. I'll tell you really quickly, Indiana actually overturned segregated schooling the year before Brown versus Board of Education. I believe it was 1953. So a year before um, the Brown, Indiana prohibited segregation. Now we'll kind of see that there's de jure and de facto segregation, and so two different forms of segregation, and one is by law, one is by practice. And you kind of see that through much of the country, even after Brown, we didn't have legal segregation, but we had segregation, de facto segregation by practice. You can find photos like the disparities, white schools versus African American schools, and you can just see how unequitable they are in terms of resources, um, the quality of the buildings, those. Um, so what James Anderson points out, and I've covered some of this information already, but that it was that Brown was a double-edged sword. Again, it was a long, kind of awaited or fought for piece of legislation, but it had a backlash. Another thing to note is Brown happens in 1954, and if you remember, hopefully you studied at least some of this or in history class, but schools don't begin to integrate into the late 1960s, early 70s, where the National Guard went down and began, escorting black students into white schools. The Little Rock Nine, those kinds of things happened much later. And what happened was for about 10, 15 years at least, states just basically, a lot of them ignored the law. They commissioned long studies. They closed schools. I'll get into an example of that in a little bit. But the problem was in the original legislation they used the term with all deliberate speed. So schools should integrate with all deliberate speed, and of course that phrasing just allowed states to basically ignore it. This is some of the iconic photography from the time period. Black schools or schools were bombed, like a lot of churches through the South. Um, 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 bombed. So when when I had in that chart, I've gone over and I've covered a little bit from Reconstruction, Jim Crow, and then the last one was the post-Brown era. And here, what I want you to know, and this is important, is the impact of Brown on the Black community. Now, there was an uptick at this time period in secondary education, and it should make sense that if African Americans through much of the country were denied access to secondary education, when schools began integrating, it provided that opportunity. Um, and then, just in general, this time period, more people in the country in general are going to high school. Um, but overall, there was a major backlash, and when black schools were shut down in the push for integration, African Americans lost heritage. James Anderson says the school was second only to the church in the cultural kind of center of the black community. So a loss of heritage, mascots, sports teams, things like that. That's explored if you've seen Remember the Titans, that movie. It decimated the careers of black teachers. Black teachers were not hired in white schools, and he gives statistics in the reading that you see like 60,000 lose their job one year, and then that just over years decimated the black teaching force. That's something we still haven't recovered from, um, and I think would be something positive for the country to focus on. And then also African American administrators. There were tens of thousands, as noted in the reading, that lost their job um, during this time period. Um, Prince Edward County is another example I wanted you to be familiar with that James Anderson uses in the piece. They, rather than integrate their schools, they shut them down. They shut down their entire public school system. They gave whites stipends to go to private schools. And in the I think it was in the 1990s, they held a sort of, ceremony and to award, degrees, high school degrees to people who were denied access to education at that time period. And there's one gentleman who's interviewed who basically says, "Look, I don't need a fake diploma. Essentially, like what I needed from you, you robbed from me 50 years ago." And that's what James Anderson basically said. This gentleman speaks for a whole generation of African American students who were denied access to education in this time period. Um, and he quotes Maya. All right. This is another key point. I'm going to go over some data really quickly here, because I want to talk about the contemporary time period. This is 1968. This is about the year over on the left of the graph that you're looking at. And this is, as a side note, this is U.S. Department of Education data that Gary Orfield, who was at Harvard and now at UCLA, and he's interviewed, I think, in one of the segments that I uploaded for you guys in the videos. He's kind of the guru on school segregation in the country. He studies it every year and tracks data. So in 1968, you can see integration. The line going up is positive. It's integration efforts, and it peaks in around the 1980s. If you look at the middle, and then around the late 80s into the 1990s, you see this dramatic decline, to where schools today are more segregated than they were when Dr. King died. Now, again, we don't have legal segregation. I think it's important to note that for Gary Orfield, he looks at any school that's more than 90% one race is segregated. So a school might have, one or two African American students, or the vice versa. You might have a predominantly African American school with one or two white students. Gary Orfield would still look at those as segregated schools. Um, and the reason for the dramatic sort of resegregation in the sense of schools is the end of busing and redistricting. And essentially through the 1980s, our country made a concerted effort to integrate schools, and that unwound. And an example that used in the reading is Milliken v. Bradley, and you should associate that with the busing decision in Michigan, in Detroit, Michigan, where African Americans then went back to sort of gave up on integration almost. And I'll share with you guys a story from the Atlantic on busing in Indianapolis public schools, because it's very similar to a lot of cases around the nation where there was a busing program in Indianapolis. It was relatively successful over a time period, but when that fell apart, schools went back to being predominantly segregated. And today we have, again, the areas outside of Indianapolis tend to be predominantly white. Um, area and then Indianapolis public schools tend to be predominantly black or Hispanic. Um, this is some more kind of segregation data. The southern region, you can kind of see here. This is Indiana, where the orange, the blue tends to be predominantly African American or predominantly segregated, and then the darker orange, predominantly white. Um, Here you can see different regions, and we'll kind of get to this, but today the most segregated regions are often generally the north. Areas with large cities like New York, Chicago. I think New York is the most segregated. So this isn't, it's kind of one of those issues where, again, at the top of this chart, the states, you'll see Illinois, New York. So I mean, you know, predominantly blue, liberal communities are often the ones today most segregated. Indiana is about mid-range, in the middle here, and so it's not by far not the most segregated or not the worst state in terms of segregation, but also not the most integrated. This is the most integrated states: West Virginia, Kentucky. So, all right. I'm gonna try to get to some other information here. I do think it's helpful for you guys to think about the impact of segregation on students, and I will say that I do think it has an impact, and I do think de facto segregation is still pretty bad for the country, and there's a lot of data and research that supports that. All right, I'm going to get to an ending point here. Dr. Anderson references the David Berliner uh, data, and this is really important for teachers to know. You will often hear people say that the United States is, in the middle of, or well down the list. Here in the 30s, here 20s, in in education performance. The thing is, what David Berliner did was disaggregated this data and found that a lot of our well-funded suburban schools would be at the top, among the top performers here. Um, and so we have some of the best schools in the world, in this country. We have the best higher education system by far, and that wouldn't be possible without having a good school system. Um, The issue is that the United States has the most inequitable school system. So we have some of the best schools in the world. We also have some of the worst. When we average them out, then we end up in about the middle of developed nations. And he disaggregated by things like class and some other factors, but oftentimes those students are poor minority students. And I think what James Anderson feels is that in a lot of cases, the unwillingness to do something about that issue stems from the fact that these are poor minority students. And these were actually given to me, these slides, by David Berliner. He spoke at Ball State a few years ago. I also like to end too by mentioning a few key points. One is, I would really hope educators would reject that idea of anti-intellectualism or the idea of being opposed to education. That idea that the African American community is disassociated with education. I mean, I think that this history illustrates the struggle and the immense commitment to education within the African American community. And the other thing that I would want to emphasize is that some of the best efforts towards integration are happening at the local level. They are teachers organizing and working to create more integrated schools, and this is happening in districts around the country. And interestingly, some of the most stubbornly segregated areas, like Boston, which was a crazy fight against integration, um, now have some really positive programs in place to create more racially diverse integrated schools. Um, Louisville, Kentucky has a great program, and there's just some different ones around the country. So I hope the reading's kind of a lot of information, and so I hope this kind of helps clarify things.